Hey guys, welcome back to Brian's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail, and today's video is definitely different than most, but I think you'll all like it, and thanks for joining me. What I find so interesting, and we're going to talk about it, and before we get into it, I would just like to ask everyone to just keep an open mind, because it took me a while to read about all these stories, and that's why there's been so much time in between my last video. And a few things I wanted to do was corroborate some of the stories and just make sure I understood some of these people and what they were saying. And like I said, it's just important for people to keep an open mind because we never know, like when we're out in the wilderness or out in the desert, what we might be seeing. It could be, when the military is testing new technology, or the government or private companies, a lot of that technology the general population doesn't even see or is aware of or is granted access to for sometimes up to decades away. I do believe that sometimes when we're out there, we run into things that we can't scientifically explain, and who knows what those could be. They could be anything from technology that is being worked on, technology from the future. It's hard to say because we honestly just don't know. What struck me about a lot of these stories were that they came from all over the world, and yet so many of them bore similarities that were incredible. And you could attribute that to, okay, we live on a steady diet of science fiction movies and TV shows full of technology and all kinds of things, crazy things sometimes. So maybe it's just that, our imaginations. What I thought was crazy was a lot of these stories were sent in to me by people over the decades. So somebody from the 60s, he told me that this story happened to him while he was hiking in the 60s. Sometimes what he would do would be set his alarm to wake him up an hour before sunrise, and then he would walk to his favorite hiking trail, which was roughly 45 minutes away, so that he could hike it right at sunrise, which I thought was actually kind of a cool idea. So anyway, this one winter morning he was doing this. He didn't realize that it was going to be snowing as much, but where apparently the mountain was, it wasn't snowing as much as where his house was. Anyway, so he said that he got to the hiking trail, and he said the sun was just coming up, so he felt like it was just a perfect day. He had plenty of water and supplies. But then when he got done with what was normally a couple-hour hike, he got back to where his footprints were, and he said that every time he would walk over the footprints, it would keep going back, almost like skipping back a frame in a movie or a macro on your computer. And he says he has no idea how he was able to break free of it, but he finally did, and he was able to get home, and he was just so grateful to be home. And I asked him about sleep paralysis. I asked all these people about sleep paralysis because a lot of them are prone to it. None of them had any clue what I was talking about. So I'm definitely not arguing the fact that there are explanations. My point more is just the similarities and coincidences between so many of these. I just found it interesting that throughout time there have been several people that have relayed the same story or the same kind of version of the story. They go out into the wilderness and they seemingly get disoriented and they feel like they're just going in laps, or they feel like they see something that looks like a mirror or something that doesn't look like it's supposed to be there. And then they never see it again in their lives. Now, I trace the roots back to these kind of things all the way back through time to the Mayas, the Aztec, the Inca, the societies, the Egyptian societies. And even though these were all spread out all over, I did find various stories, especially about them talking about giants and various other stories about beings that lived out in the wilderness, which when I translated the text, often it sounded like they were talking about a Bigfoot or a Bigfoot type entity. So again, I don't care what you believe, I just found that very interesting. Throughout the history of man, where we can get the same type of stories, especially people looking up at the sky and saying they saw things or see things. And obviously people 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, they didn't have the same technology as we do now. So how would they be able to write or draw about these type of things that we often talk about today? It's certain things that, at least in my brain, I can't scientifically explain. Obviously back then they probably saw meteors and comets, and they misattributed them to maybe being a god or something. But in today's world, we have a lot more knowledge and a lot more technology, so it's harder to to mistake things like that. But then again, throughout the course of human history, it's one thing that we learn, that we can always be wrong. I mean, for the longest time, we thought Earth was the center of the universe and that it was flat. And it took like one or two people to disprove that. And then we had people throughout the years like Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, and then of course Einstein, who basically these few men throughout history changed our world forever, technology-wise, physics-wise. And who's to say that in another maybe 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, there'll be another man like that comes along and gives us more technology or more new physics laws. And in my mind, there is almost 100% chance that there will be another man like that, or a woman. And I think it's exciting to consider all the new possibilities and all the new technologies that we might have waiting for us, especially from what we've seen. Anyway, so this next story, this guy, he really had me in stitches. I had to actually talk to him on the phone because I was having trouble understanding him, but he was out hiking with his family. Actually, it was just his wife and his wife's brother and his brother's wife. It was 4 of them. They were out hiking, and they were out on the West Coast somewhere here in the United States. And they said that somehow they got separated right around lunchtime. One of them put their bag down to get some sandwiches out. He said they turned around and the other couple was just gone. They had been like maybe 10 feet away and they were just gone. And they said that they looked for 2 or 3 hours, and they said that they actually split down the trail. So the wife went one way and the husband went the other way, which I wouldn't have done that, but that's what they did. And they were able to rendezvous back up together. Then together they were looking for another 3 hours and they still couldn't find them. So they contacted the authorities. They did this as soon as they could find a spot on the trail with a cell service, and it was about 3/4 of the way down. The policeman took their story over the phone. He said that he would send a car out, contact the local rangers. I'm not sure what park or area of California this was in, but it was somewhere in California. So the couple themselves started to walk down to the car because that's what the policeman told them to do. Well, on the way down to the car, this crazy fog moved into the area, and they found the wife standing just in the middle of the trail, sort of in this confused state. And so they went up to her, and it took them, this is what he said. Now, people tend to exaggerate, but he said that it took them 5 to 10 minutes to snap her out of this trance that she was in. And they later found the husband lying on the ground in sort of a pile of sticks. I mean, he was fine. They were both fine, but they seemed to be sort of in this fog. And I know I asked the same thing. Neither of them had a history of doing any drugs. They didn't have any alcohol with them, so can rule that out. There was no history of mental illness in the families. I think this was just one of those bizarre things where this was one of the stories that I was happy that it had a happy ending, like they were able to get out, but it was just so bizarre. And this guy, he had a very credible resume. I mean, from what he did his whole life, he was very credible. And I was able to speak to the wife too, which she said she had no clue what happened. They were there, and then all of a sudden they just remembered the other couple waking them up. They have no memory of what happened in between. They just remember getting woken up, and they felt like they were asleep, and it was really foggy, and they didn't understand what was going on. And that was it. Now, I have no idea what might have happened in this one. I mean, it's just so bizarre. But talking to these people, I mean, they just sounded so truthful, and they had never told anybody else the story. So now this next story happened to a woman named Nancy somewhere in the Oregon forest on the Pacific Crest Trail. And this was almost 25 years ago. So her being able to tell me this story with such ferocity and such emotion was just unbelievable. And it was also scary in many ways, but she said that she got into this part of the trail where she was alone, and it was the first time that she'd been on the trail alone the whole time. She'd started in Campo, Mexico, and had done the whole trail with a whole family of people. It's usually called a trail family. And she got up to this one point, and she was just by herself. And she said that she's kind of was panicking. So who knows? This could be a part of it, but she said she woke up this one night and she felt like people were trying to get into her tent. She saw like a bunch of hands on her tent, and there was a lot of like screaming in the woods. And again, this isn't the first time I've heard someone say that they were camping out in the woods and they woke up in the middle of the night. They heard like screaming. It sounded like a baby. Now, of course, sometimes you can, if you don't know what a mountain lion or a bobcat sounds like, their screams when they're doing their mating calls, it can be very scary. But these people were all they had been in the wilderness all their lives. They could tell the difference between what a mountain lion sounded like and, a human. And they said that they definitely would see hands on their tent. And again, there's been probably at least half a dozen stories that I've read that involved similar accounts. Now, this could just be attributed to bad guys lurking out in the wilderness, and trying to survive out there. And when they see hikers come along, they steal their food bags, and this does happen. So it's a big possibility that this could have been the case. But she was lucky enough she said that she made this noise with her mouth. She could sound like a dog barking, and she used to do this to like tease her high school teachers because she sounded so realistic. Well, she made this sound and it scared off whatever was on her tent. And again, it's just one of those stories where it's just so bizarre and creepy. This next story came from a British guy who was living in Russia at the time. He said that he was, I guess, stuck there for years, and he was living up near Siberia, just south of it, so he would get seasonal weather now and then. He got into hiking because it was the only real sport activity he could find to do. And this happened back in, I guess, throughout the 70s and 80s, his time there, and then 90s, early 90s. So this was all during the big transition of the USSR to what is Russia now. And anyway, so he said that this one weekend he went out, and it was just as the weather had turned. And up in Siberia, it's obviously crazy cold and snowing all the time. But he was accustomed to this. He had the proper gear, and he had set up his tent. And he woke up that night to hearing all these bangs in the sky. And he looked up, and it looked like a bunch of what he said looked like flying saucers. And then he looked out in the distance, and he said he had binoculars, and he looked out and he said it looked like a bunch of men in the snow on the ground with weapons, and they were looking up at the sky and shooting these things off from the ground that looked kind of like what he would call fireworks, but they obviously weren't fireworks, because he said they went up into the sky and they had a controlled motion about it, and then they would come back down. And he said that he had never seen anything like that, even like remote controlled planes and that kind of thing. It just looked very advanced. And when he was telling me this story, it sounded to me a lot like the accounts of what people in our country, in the USA, talk about when they talk about the secret base out in the desert, Area 51, that base that everyone knows about now and that everyone talks about. And now, since it's made public, you can't even get close to it. It's so heavily guarded. Sounded like to me that would be the perfect place where Russians would test secret things, because no one wants to go up in Siberia. It's freezing cold, and it would just be a perfect place to, have a secret base. But again, this is just my thoughts. I mean, he kind of had the same thought in his head, but it's hard to say. But I remember the way he was describing it at the time. He said that this technology, and he said he couldn't even put it into words, because at the time he didn't know what he was looking at. He said that the best he could just say was like these advanced fireworks rockets that could shoot back up and then come back down, and these soldiers were like controlling them somehow with their, he said the way he spoke about it was, this guy was obviously just enthralled with what he saw, and he was obviously also combinedly perplexed. He told me it wasn't until decades later where he thought he might have had a grasp on the concept, and he said it looked like modern day drones or something with LCD displays that they could control. He said the men were all holding what we now attribute to be modern day cell phones, or something that had an LCD display that had some sort of high technology about it. He said his only regret was not having a camera, but then he laughed and said, well, the camera I would have had wouldn't have had the technology to capture it. And I wanted to thank him and everybody else who contributed to this video and sent me stories, because I know it's been tough. You've had to write me to my P.O. box. They've been writing to me because my email's been so messed up. And some of the stories, they've actually left their numbers. I had to talk to them on the phone, because some of them have been so intense, and I'm actually going to do a part 2 of this video just because it took me a while to just get all these stories, even though it might not sound like to you guys that it took a while to put this together. But it's been a rough few weeks with the broken foot and the insomnia. I now know what it feels like to go without sleep for several days at a time. You feel like your days are so long. You know, it feels like one day is 3 days. Wouldn't wish it upon anybody, but I hope everybody is doing great, and I'm working on another video, so I should have another video up tomorrow, and at least one on the weekend. And if you guys have any ideas, you can just leave them in the comment section. A missing case tomorrow, and then on the weekend probably another missing case, and then next week will be the second part of this video. And yeah, if you guys have any questions for me, just let me know. I appreciate everybody watching as always, and I appreciate everybody being patient with the upload schedule lately. I know it's been a little slower than normal, but things have been kind of tough. But I do appreciate your patience and everybody being so kind. And as always, I want to thank everybody for watching, and please be respectful in the comments if you choose to leave them. And I will see everybody in the next one. Take care. And for those of you that might be asking why I did this video or these topics, I've gotten more requests to do these kind of unusual events or stories from people that have actually experienced them. And I just thought it was fair. That's why I wanted to cover as many as I could, and ones that I felt had some credibility to them when I spoke to these people or talked to them on the phone. And that's honestly the most time-consuming thing, is going through all the different letters, or when I had email. I did have a bunch of them thankfully forwarded when Gmail was working on my account, and they were able to forward me a bunch of my messages. But anyway, you got to go through everything, pick out ones that sound credible, and contact the people again. And then, it's just going a lot of back and forth, which is nice, but it does take a lot of time. And these stories I thought had a lot of credibility. I have a couple others that I wanted to share, but I didn't have all the information back. But this one story that I know everybody will love, and it has to do with people out in the jungle and in the desert and in the woods. One of the things, for me at least, I love studying the ancient cultures, and ancient Egypt for one. I think that their civilization, they were around for thousands of years. And here, at least in modern day America, we've only been around for a few hundred years. I mean, at least our modern civilization. And I just think that there's a lot about ancient cultures that we still don't know. I think that they had a lot of stuff that we still aren't aware of. I think it has just gotten buried over time and lost in time. That's just my opinion. And I think that over time we will continue to find these things and be wowed by them. I think every time we discover a new ancient Egypt thing, we're always wowed by it. So in the next video, we'll be talking about the video that I just mentioned, as long as I can get all the information back from the various sources, and we'll talk more about some ancient civilizations and stories that were passed along throughout the generations, and how similar they are, and how they resemble a lot of the stories that we have often heard and told today. Now, whether that's just myths and legends being passed through generations, I don't know. We'll see. See you next time.